Hey
So how's it going,
now.
Mike?
It is going really well. First week of remote learning here at Northwest State Community College, and it's been a really good week, in all honesty. Connected to all of
Cool.
my students, which is awesome. I think everybody participated in a live streamed Zoom session. Not all of them, but I at least saw everybody in my program in a live session this week. So feedback has been really good. The work that they've done as part of that has been really good. And I'm even more encouraged now than ever to continue on the path that you and I have talked about of taking the best from online and the best from face to face, and to turn that into what we're affectionately calling responsive learning experience design. So,
Right. Cool. Now, do you, to what extent are you kind of using the LMS? So I know we've talked the last couple times a lot about the Zoom sessions and how to replicate what goes on in a classroom. Um, so two-part question on that. One, to what extent are you using that? And the second part is that any different than the way you're using it before?
so no, I'm not. It's not really any different now than before. The way that I've used the LMS in the past, uh, in an online class. So we'll start with assignments. In an online class, I usually give fairly explicit instructions inside of the LMS in the assignment description. In a face-to-face class, usually in the LMS description, I have details to be provided in class,
Mhm.
because within my discipline, I need people who can take notes, ask questions, and not necessarily just follow a checklist to make things
Right.
happen.
Right.
Online, I give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. Um, so with assignments, I use that. Obviously, the grade book is also connected into assignments, and that helps tremendously. Uh, our LMS that we use here is similar to others where you have lesson pages. And those
Okay.
lesson pages, content pages for me, really are just content, external resources that I've created, external resources through YouTube, things like that, and structured in a modular fashion. So each module has its own page that then has the content, some guidance on what I want you to do with stuff, and then links to set prior mentioned assignments at the bottom of that. What's cool about our LMS, it also has a checklist feature. So every module, I put a checklist on top for everything that you need to do as part of that. And me as the instructor can actually even see the back end of who's checked off what. And the more
Mhm.
people use that checklist, typically the more successful they are. That's anecdotal. There's no real data
Right.
behind that, but
Right.
anecdotally, yeah. So the other features that I'm using within our LMS, same as before, but a little bit more extensive, is the announcements feature.
Okay.
Um, Announcements feature shows up in the LMS, but then also can be pushed out as email notifications. Uh, I'm sending out one of those after every class, just recapping what went on in class, and then also the
Right.
links to the live stream video and transcript from the live
Right.
stream session.
Right.
Where in the
Well, that
past it
gets
was
back to
only
what
kind of
we
once or twice.
right. Well, that gets back to what we talked about earlier in the week, right? Where structure is really important, right? Like
Yeah,
this can work really well, but reinforcing, having that structure there, but then also a consistent communication plan, right? And
yeah.
getting things out there consistently. So that's cool. So far so good for you. What kind of feedback have you gotten from other faculty members, if any?
From the faculty that I talked to and did Zoom training with over the past week, the response has been very positive. They like it. It's working for them. Um, any of the issues are simple, like are just, hey, is my account been upgraded? Because we went through that whole basic to pro account conversion here recently. And then questions about sharing, because Zoom allows you to share from Zoom, but where there's questions on the amount of storage that you have, and does
Right.
that work for actual like true distribution of content? I mean,
Right.
that is the one big thing here. Um, One of the two big things here when we start talking about remote delivery of synchronous sessions for asynchronous consumption is the workflow after the fact, with post
Right.
processing of the videos, captioning, transcripts, and then the delivery method that makes is useful not only for that one time the first time a student has to interact with content, but whenever they want to actually maybe go back and check something
Right.
out, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah. I mean, because that's very. I mean, like you said, there's a whole post production workflow there, which is the same as like what we do with these video casts and podcasts, right? You got to
yeah,
take the media, you got to lightly edit it, maybe put some, intro stuff on it or whatever. I mean, it takes a minute, right, to do it.
yep.
Even if all you're doing is converting it and uploading it to YouTube, you still got to do something, right? So there's still some work to do at the back end.
And it's one of those things, two reasons. Really, it has to be timely because you have students who need it.
Right.
And with accessibility laws that I again looked into this weekend or this week again, you're not supposed to release that video unless you have the transcript ready to go at the same time.
Well, and one of the best quotes I saw somebody on LinkedIn is, accessibility is not a best practice, it's the law. Right. It's not a suggestion.
Yeah.
It's, and right. And to be fair, you really need to, right. You got to get that out there to be fair to your participants.
Yeah. The other thing though, too, is part of that, just like the timeliness of doing things. When you're running 4 or 5 classes, if you get behind in your post-production work,
it takes
you
can't dig your way out.
Yeah. I mean, I'm using Trello. I'm using Trello for it, which has been helpful. I've got checklists made up in Trello so I can do all that happy stuff. And if I have some backup for helping with that post-production for myself and others that were interested in doing it. But again, I think it's one of those things that unless there's a system in place at your institution to do this, faculty, it's just a lot of time, and faculty, there's so many other things that they have to do. That post-production of content is not what they're trained to do, nor is it part of their contract.
Right.
So,
well, yeah, suddenly you're not only an instructor of, however many classes, now you're a media company.
Yeah. I basically told the president of our institution, last week, like, we are now a media company. If we're going to continue to do remote stuff, we're going to have to start thinking more like a media company than anything else.
Yeah, that's great. So, we've been thinking about this a little bit too on the corporate side. Obviously we had, we have contracts out there that, we were going to have in person. They weren't set to start for a while, but now of course we need to modify those. And we've been talking a lot about, what does that look like? How do you bring them online? And again, following a lot of the best practices that we've talked about here. One of the questions I had for you before we kind of move on is, did you have a chance to use the breakout room feature this week at all? And if so, how did it work?
Phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. And actually, I can probably share with you, as long as I get permission from a few people, I can share with you the class that we did this past week. It was a exact replica of what we do face-to-face.
Excellent. So any tips, like, for somebody that wants to do this, were there any tricky pieces, any, kind of tips to make it easier, or, is it, what does it look like?
So it helps to have a group that's socially comfortable together.
Right.
Bottom line. I put most of the success I'm having within this remote model based on the fact that we work so hard in our face-to-face with socialization. So it basically boils down to taking an hour and 50 minutes is class time, right? The first, we'll say 15 to 30 minutes of that is me kind of ranting and discussing and kind of just setting the tone and talking. Actually about 15 minutes ranting, and then 15 minutes of me going through a presentation. I've shared that model with you before. I think it goes like, how are we going to do what we're going to do? Set it up with a narrative, give the objective, how are we going to do it? And then how are we going to measure success, all that kind of good stuff. And then we used the breakout room feature, and I broke them up into groups of 4.
Now, can you talk about that? So just from a really nuts and bolts. So I know with Zoom, there's a couple things you can do, right? You can sort people into breakout rooms ahead of time. You can do it on the fly. So let's say we have a class of 12, right? And you wanted to break them into 4. We're in our Zoom session right now. what's the step-by-step? How do you break them out and assign them and get them into their rooms?
So the breakout room feature has to actually be turned on in your Zoom settings, not from the Zoom application, but
That's
actually
in your account settings,
in your
right?
account
Yeah, you
settings.
got to be
Yes.
able to enable
Yep.
that.
And then you'll click that button and a dialog box will pop up and it will give you, it'll say you have 12 participants, how many rooms you'd like to break them into. You pick the number of rooms that you want. Then there's a radio button for automatic or manual selection. And then there might be another radio button. I can't remember for another setting, but those are the only two I think that you need, is the number of rooms and whether automatic or manual. And then you open the rooms. And when you open the rooms, then you get a list of the people who would be in those rooms. And even at that point, even if it's automatic, you're able to move some people around. So even automatic has the option to do a little bit of manual tweaking after the fact. Then you hit a button that says invite guests to their rooms. They get a pop-up on their screen, and once they click that, they vanish from yours. Each of those rooms then has a join option for the host. So just like when I kick my students out of the classroom to go whiteboard out in the halls or wherever else, it's just like me making rounds, walking in and checking in on them. So
great.
I'm also able then to broadcast a message to everybody from being in the main room by itself. That just pops up as a little dialog box on their screen. They have full function, full control, as long as it's turned on, which I think by default it is, of using the whiteboard.
Yep.
So the whiteboard feature, the annotation feature. So I gave my students I kicked them out into a breakout room, 10 minutes, checked in on them. 10 minutes later, checked in on them. Everything was going fine. I course corrected a little bit when I needed to. And then when I saw that we were in a good spot, I was like, okay, you guys got 10 more minutes. Somebody keep track of time because I'm going to call you back. I call them back by hitting a button that gives them 1 minute to return. And then boop, their breakout rooms close down and they show back up. So we spent of the 30 minutes in class together, then about 30 minutes in the breakout sessions.
Gotcha. Cool. So one of the things I'll do is I know you shared a link with me from the Zoom folks getting started with breakout rooms.
Mm-hmm.
So in the show notes for this, I'll put a link out to that video so people can look at that as well. I mean, that's a really good explanation, and just those mechanics. So just to kind of recap, right, for somebody who wants to do this, you turn it on in your settings. And then when you start your meeting, you can go ahead and you figure out how many breakout rooms you want. And then you basically just do this on the fly when you start up your session for whatever particular class you're teaching that day, correct?
Yep.
All right, perfect. That's great.
And again, the model for what we do in that virtual breakout session has been established in a face-to-face session before. Right, so I want to preface everything with the fact I'm working with a group that is comfortable working together, socialized face-to-face, and now moving remote.
So it might be a good idea to, like, if you were going to do this and it's just an online class and there hasn't been that socialization, use this as an icebreaker, as a socialization tool 100%. That A, gets people to know each other, and B, gets people used to using the breakout rooms. It doesn't have anything to do with the class. It's just all about meeting each other, doing some icebreaker activities, getting back together. And now everybody understands the tools, kind of knows each other a little bit, and then makes that easier as the week goes on.
100%. Yeah.
Course goes on, I should say. So, okay.
Yeah. I mean,
cool.
Because I think too, so much of online, and, I've ranted about this before, is just like utility of I'm here, I'm going to do this, and yada, yada. I'm going to be on my island and make it happen. I think us as instructional designers or designers, learning experience architects, we can design things that get people to be social, even in these virtual environments, right?
Yeah,
even,
exactly.
So a trick I did is I actually put on, there's a lot of options in Zoom. There's an option to set up a waiting room. So the host has to allow people in. Then there's also the option of, hey, just anybody can come in wherever. What I've done is I've let people just come in. I start the room. I mute my camera, or I turn off my camera. I mute my settings, and I walk away, or I'll sit here and listen, whatever. Right. But then class starts at 2. I'll pop in at 2 and say, hey, we're going to let some people kind of show up. You guys talk amongst yourselves. And then I mute again and go away. And now my group is socialized already. So they'll talk about random nonsense, which I think just adds to the whole comfort level of, hey, this is
Agreed.
a place where you're allowed to talk. This is not just me
Yep.
talking. We're all supposed to talk here.
Right. Right.
Because, you know,
Good.
we go
Cool.
to webinars and stuff like that, and you sit there for an hour and you never say a word, and they just talk, and you're
Well, and
kind
you
of,
sit there for an hour, and then you, like you say, I'm checking my mail. I'm
yeah,
on Slack. I'm doing a million other things because I feel like I'm getting talked at. I'm not part of a discussion.
yeah, exactly, 100%.
Okay, cool. So one of the things we talked about a little bit before the show, right? So, we wanted to recap week one, but then kind of get into, this has been a great learning experience. I know on my end, having to switch everything to online and rethink, enterprise and corporate training has really changed my approach for how we're going to do things moving forward. And I know you said this is really going to influence you in the
Yeah,
fall. And just a quick mention, I know from our end, because, the company I work for works with a lot of, degree, graduate degree programs, right? 4-year institutions. And there's a few institutions right now that are a little bit worried about their fall semester at all,
yeah.
right? What is it going to look like? And so again, rethinking, what if fall semester has to be online? How can we make that happen? That kind of thing. So I know that kind of touches on, so how is this going to change your approach to next fall?
So next fall, I am going to, over the summer, I'm going to redesign these classes. So next fall, you would only have to come to class once a month. So over, was it 3 months, 4 months? Once a month is all the time I would actually require you to come to class. Now, the reason for that is because we serve a 6-county region in Northwest Ohio. And to drive here 2 days a week or even 1 day a week for people just doesn't make sense. But I do value that face-to-face time, especially up front, and check-in times, and that just makes you feel a little bit more cohesive,
Right.
I think. So I'm going to be doing face-to-face sessions once a month, face-to-face required sessions once a month, face-to-face and remote blended lecture sessions once a week. So
Okay.
for the lecture component, if you want to come here, sweet. If you want to tune in via remote and participate remote, sweet. We'll have TVs. So like I will deck this room out so you will actually feel like you're in this room, right?
Right.
And then that would be synchronous delivery, but then also recorded again for anybody of those people that are working, whatever, can't get here, so that we have access to those sessions, those live sessions asynchronously.
Okay. So that was one of the things I wanted to ask you about, and just to kind of explain to me. So you're going to have a once a week session. I can either come in or not come in.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if I want to participate with you synchronously but remotely, you're going to allow them to do something like this.
100%.
Okay.
And instead
then,
of me being here, there will be a moderator sitting here to basically be the hand raising and the question asking for the people in the remote session.
Okay. So how are you going to then have the remote? Are you going to have the remote session people get into groups with the people in the class?
It'll probably depend on the makeup, right? If I only have 2 people remote, then yes, somehow, some way, they're probably going to have to be interwoven into the face-to-face group. And maybe that means everybody in face-to-face, you know what, you guys, you're all going to separate corners of this campus. You're going to put on headsets and you're going to use the computers and be remote.
Right. See, and that was the thing I was going to ask, is like, even if I come in face-to-face, I mean, maybe for the lecture, I don't need to be on Zoom, but when we go into breakout rooms,
100%.
get into the Zoom meeting, get into your breakout room, and, let's do this. Well, and it could be, right, if I'm in my corner and, let's say you're remote and it's, me and somebody else here, we could still just share we could sit in front of my laptop with you, right, and still do it. So we wouldn't even have to be completely physically separated,
right,
to do that. But I like that. So you're bringing, and I think this is a key, right, to what you said earlier, bringing the best of online and the best of in person together.
Yes.
And so usually we think of, well, when you're online, we'll try to replicate the face-to-face, but in this case, even if I'm face to face, there's going to be some remote interaction, right?
Yeah,
And you're going to
because
use some of the same tools, even if I'm in the classroom, some of those same tools that I do for distance learning, because that's now just part of the course, right?
and it's part of our new normal.
Yeah, exactly.
If you can't function in remote right now, you are screwed,
Right.
and that's not going
Right.
to
Well, I mean,
change.
and again, we talk about this every time, right? All three sessions we've done so far. But my entire team is remote.
Yep.
So like when this whole lockdown happened, my day to day didn't change one
Yeah.
iota. I work from my home, and all of my team members are scattered all over the globe. I have team members in South Africa.
Yeah.
I had team members all over the United States, and and this is the way we do things. And sometimes, right, when we're in the office, every once in a while we go to, New York or wherever to the office, and we still interact, right? We'll get together and we'll put the remote people on, on Zoom or whatever it is, Google Hangouts,
Right.
and we have that meeting. So to your point, right, this is a skill that you need to have. As when you get out into the world, you're going to need to do this. And so I think that's brilliant. I think it should be a part of every course.
Yeah. I just don't know. The future of work requires you to be able to function remotely.
Yeah, 100%.
Especially, I live in so my student population, they like Northwest Ohio. They don't want to leave here. It's going to be a slow roll to get up to snuff, not up to snuff, up to speed with some of the other places with regard to the employment opportunities.
Yep.
So best case scenario right now, we keep our money local, our smart people local, even if they are doing work for people in Dayton or Columbus or Zimbabwe or who knows where.
Yeah, right. It doesn't matter. But yeah, at least you're bringing those salaries. You're keeping those salaries home. You're spending in the local economy, and and I mean, and that's what I do, right? I mean, I've lived in Austin, Texas. I've lived in LA. I've lived in Columbus, and loved them all. But we wanted to move to a smaller town. It's a little bit more remote, and I like it here.
Mm-hmm.
And because of remote work, I can, my company's headquarters are in New York City.
Yep.
No big deal. So,
well
that's
and
cool.
Even for us, right? For us, remote is Van Wert and Paulding County, which is 2 counties away, which is for some people in rural America, it might as well be Zimbabwe when it comes to having access to transportation and stuff like that.
Right.
So,
right. So cool.
So yeah, so like that portion of it, synchronous, asynchronous, here, there, wherever, doesn't matter. And then similar with the lab component of my classes, basically what it's going to be is it's going to be open lab. You just need to come in and put the time in one way or another.
Right.
And whether that is documentation of what you're doing remotely, that will suffice just as if you're being here working together. And again, that same thing would be like, okay, the lab is open and there's a Zoom channel open all time for that lab if you want to just pop in and get some feedback on some stuff, because that's where the value for us is in lab, is that feedback and communicating with each other. So
well, that's what we did at the Guild, right? The open office hours.
Yeah.
We're going to have somebody there, pop in, ask questions. And if there's somebody else there, it's great. You can learn from each other and learn from each other's questions and whatever. So one question I have you thought about, so I have, if I'm one of your students now, I have that option. There's going to be, there maybe one time I have to come in face-to-face a month. And then you have these other weekly lectures. So I can get there synchronously from a remote standpoint. So for those weekly ones, you're going to require attendance, just not necessarily in person?
Yeah.
Okay. And then of course, obviously if you miss because you're sick or whatever, you can get the recording. You just don't get but you don't get the benefit of the group work. Or
the benefit of being able to ask your question then and there.
Right. So you're not saying you don't have to show up at all. You're just saying you only have to show up in person one time, but you still, if you really want to get anything out of the class, you need to show up either remotely or in person for that the weekly meeting.
Yes. And I think I'm not instituting it right now because obviously we're in some special circumstances. But But what I'm probably going to do for people who miss the synchronous session is for their attendance, they're going to have to produce an artifact of notes that they've taken during the lecture.
Yep. Yep.
Which
Right.
Honestly, I do that for my face-to-face anyway, a lot of times. And that's probably going to be a global requirement because I don't want different rules for everybody. Like
Yep.
at the end of this class today, for you to prove your attendance, you're going to take a picture of your page in your field notes, and that's what you're going to submit to the LMS
Perfect.
as your assignment.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. So the other thing we wanted to touch on real quick before we,
It won't be real quick, Ward.
No. I should say the other thing that's going to could take as much time as we could possibly put in, but we want to start a conversation, right? We want to start a conversation a little bit on how you manage, right? We talk about responsive learning experience design. We've talked a little bit about what it is, but at the crux of the problem, right? No matter what kind of course you're designing, right, is the workflow and the way to manage that work and the way to, ensure quality and consistency across. And, so again, this is something you and I have been talking about for probably 5 or 6 years. And so I think where we've come, right, is we both have experience with software development. We both have a little bit of experience. You have a lot more experience with like video production and that kind of stuff. And I have a little bit just from my time with you. And then there's also kind of this kind of publishing, right? And I think,
Mm-hmm.
We can draw from those 3 things to come up with a workflow. So I think, so when we first kind of started thinking about this, me being a software engineer, I'm like, well, it's just like building software. Right. So let's use agile methodologies and we can use, Jira or whatever kind of tracking tool, and it's going to work great. That's not true. It just isn't, right? Because it's not just like software. I think we swung kind of the other direction, right? Where we put together a really, for context, right? We started out with Jira at one of the jobs we had.
Yeah.
And just found that we were fighting Jira all the time. And mainly because you can't put a meaningful amount of work in one person's hands in curriculum development and have them be able to handle everything. Whereas in software development, if I have a feature, I'm the software developer. I can build the whole thing. I can build unit tests. I can build the software. I can integrate it. I can check it in. I can do the whole thing. So we kind of fought that. So
and I spent more time closing people's Jira tickets than anything else.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It was just such a pain in the butt, right? It became a farce, right? Yeah. It became a farce, right? It became awful because for 2 reasons, right? People weren't using it because they didn't see the value. And the other thing is that we were just beating Jira into submission and making it do things that it didn't want to do.
Yeah.
So then we kind of swung the other way, right? We started using Trello. I love Trello. I still love Trello. And we kind of just took a full, almost video production kind of workflow. And why don't you talk through that a little bit, like how we...
Well, it took us a while to get through there, though, because we used Trello and it got gross. Trello can get real gross real fast, right?
It did, yeah.
So within video production, you've got basically 3 phases: pre-production, production, and post-production. Pre-production is all of the planning, getting everything together, everybody cast, knowing all who your characters are, all the parts are, everything that you want to be able to put this together, the scheduling, the financing, right? All of that stuff is part of pre-production. Production then is following that schedule of creating shooting all the scenes and getting everything together. And then the post-production is really the editing. And I think we lopped on the distribution as well. Right. Which I think works fairly well for software development. But again, it at least finally gave us like 3 buckets, I think 3 phases that were similar enough to the software development lifecycle, which has 5 phases, give or take. The planning, design, and then the development, and then the deployment.
Testing and deployment, right? And then you just kind of keep iterating through those. So that's the other thing that's a little different, right? Is that with Agile, right, you go through those, but you keep going through those over and over and over, and you kind of build a strand at a time, right? In Agile. And that's, you can't do that you can't, you're going to shoot the whole thing, right? I mean, you shoot different scenes,
Right.
through that and whatever. But it's a little bit kind of like you said, you go through this process: pre-production, production, post-production, distribution. You go through it once, right? You don't necessarily go through it over and over and over for different strands of the thing. So there's similarities, but there's differences.
Yeah. The one thing I think that sometimes that I see even now is with course development, you really have to have that vision of all of it.
Yep.
And sometimes you got to start working on a couple things to help have that vision coalesce.
Yep.
But then at some point it has to become, no, this lesson is a feature and you're going to just work on this feature, whoever you are. Yep. We're going to make sure that you're working on this thing. I think what happens sometimes with subject matter experts, especially, is they start to try to do all of it at once. And that's when it gets really, really gross. So how, what do we do to manage that? It's part of
So the one thing that I think the big advantage that we found in moving to a like a movie or video production model was the fact that we could track a piece of work, but we could track it through the different phases, and we could assign it to different people based on the phase, right? And so there's a certain group of people work on pre-production and production. A different group of people maybe work on the post-production, and maybe a third set work on distribution or whatever, right? So what was nice about that is through that life cycle, we could drag it through the different phases, and then we could tag somebody else on it and take that other person off, and it worked really well. Whereas in Jira, right, if you have a feature, it's assigned to you, you're the software developer, and it eventually goes to QA or whatever, and comes back and you get assigned bugs, but you don't really assign it to different people as it goes through the life cycle.
But remember though, in Trello, we didn't let anybody else manage our Trello. We didn't even let us touch our Trello. Like you and I were checking, because we use the checklist feature. And I think this is what's really important with all of this, like the separation of things. There's a reason you have a hammer and a screwdriver and not a hammer driver, right? I mean, there's reasons we have different tools.
Right.
Because I think we use GitHub and the issues in GitHub, which is where, and I think we fell back on get your tool that you're going to use to monitor things as close to the source as possible.
Yep.
So we're using Jira to manage GitHub stuff. It's like, well, GitHub already has something built in to actually make that happen. And then we were just using Trello as kind of almost like a QA to double check that those issues and other things have been taken care of.
Exactly. And it gave us that oversight. So I think, one of the kind of epiphanies I had here recently, because again, at work, we're kind of revisiting this because we're transitioning some people to a different team, and they use some different, tools and techniques, and, they're going down some of the paths that we've gone down before. Yep. And, I asked, hey, well, how do you solve this, that, or the other thing? And they didn't have a good answer. I'm like, our answer was we stopped using Jira. Yeah. So, but I think where I've come to now, it gets back to what you said, is you have to have somebody at whatever level, and it can go from a micro level to a macro level. There has to be a role that can oversee, can kind of see the whole field at whatever level that is. And so one of the things that you and I've talked about is that the instructional designer, right? And whether that's a junior designer all the way up to a learning experience design architect, right, is that person, right? They're the people that can see the whole field. The main difference, right, in a curriculum development thing versus a software development thing is that the smallest standalone unit of meaningful work in curriculum is probably a lesson, but it's still made up of things that not one single person can do, right? Yes. Because you have to have an author, you might have to have a subject matter expert. Maybe they're the same, maybe they're not. And maybe the instructional designer is the author and working with a subject matter expert. You don't know. There has to be a graphic designer. The graphic designer may be the same person that puts the slide deck together if you need a slide deck. You need a script writer who could be the author, but maybe it's somebody else. And then you have to have the people shooting the video. You have to have the talent in the video, all of those things, right? And you have to edit the video, the post-production of the video. But at the end of the day, you still have to have that person at the top that knows what this lesson is supposed to be about and can make sure that the connective tissue between the video and the slide deck and the written material and the exercises all make sense, right? That we're not saying one thing over here and another thing over here, right? So you have the ID, the instructional designer, is the coordinator, right, of all of that. And at the end of the day, has to make sure that it all just makes sense, right, together. And that's not something that you have on a task level in an agile software development methodology, right?
Well, and it's even because what you have are different systems which have different workflows doing their things, sometimes in parallel, sometimes, what's the Gantt chart term? You know what I'm saying? Like,
oh, right. Sometimes they're serial, sometimes they're parallelized, right? And sometimes they're, sometimes they're on a critical path, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
So if I'm playing the role of instructional designer, all I want in Trello is probably in the overall Trello would be one place to check off that the video is done for that lesson. Exactly. I don't need a freaking 20. I don't need all of that in there, because that's what turns Trello into complete garbage. When you try to use one tool or one board or whatever to do everything, it's not going to work. Right. As they're designed now, I should say.
Right. And at that point, right, you can then go to whoever is, at that point, right, you can kind of almost do an outsourcing kind of model, right?
100%.
It's like, hey, I need this video, and even if it's not truly outsourcing, they're probably on your team. But you're going to say,
different department.
Listen, right, different department. You guys are the video experts. Here's my backlog of videos. Here's my script. This is what I need to have done, and here's my schedule. You guys manage your process. I don't really care how that works. But what I do need is that we got to have a contract. I'm going to give you X amount of lead time, and you're going to turn this back around to me in whatever service level agreement we have, right? So that I can manage that process. I'm not responsible for that, but I'm responsible for making sure it's done, right? As the coordinator of the instructional design.
And I don't want to be a pain in your ass bugging you for stuff.
And I don't want to micromanage your process. What your process is. You're a pro. Right.
But if you've got some semblance of a dashboard that you can provide to me, so I can click a link and check when somebody asks me a question. Yep. Then we're good.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And a lot of times, right, it's like I forget what it was called, but there's I think Vimeo has this, but there's a couple other sites out there that are like video review sites. Yeah. Right. So you can click on, it's like, give me the link, and then I can go review the videos. I can give you feedback, and we can go back and forth like that.
Well, I think
whatever that might be.
I think this is where, though, the role of the learning experience architect is really, really vital, because they are the ones who should be determining what is actually MVP for these things. Right? Video might not always be necessary. Video might be nice, but it might not be necessary.
Yep.
So having.
But I think the other thing that's really key, right, to the architect role is that, and this gets back to our responsive piece, right? These lessons are, we want them to be modular.
Yes.
And so so that's not to say that in a course you don't have connective tissue, but you don't want to embed the connective tissue inside the lesson. So this lesson, so this is where that architect role really comes in and says, okay, I know what I want this course to be, but I also know that I want each of these modules to be loosely coupled. So again, this is where like a lot of ideas from software development come in. I don't want all my lessons tightly coupled and bound together. I want them to stand alone.
Well,
and then I want to put a layer, right? I want to put a layer over top that connects them together into a narrative, but it's something that you lay across the top of it. It's not something you embed in it, right?
Yes.
And that's where that architect can give that that direction, and can put that connective tissue together, so that lessons go into modules. So now we can make sure that the module is cohesive. Modules go into units. We can make sure units cohesive, and then finally units go into courses, and we can make sure that that's cohesive. But that's where I agree with you, that learning experience architect, that's where that role is, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Do we want to talk about where we should author our text?
Well,
whether or not we should use Markdown and Git for our text files for curriculum.
Yeah, I mean that's a really great question, right?
A lot of smart people still haven't figured that out. That's all I want to say.
Agreed.
Uh,
Agreed. So, part of it is right. And so I think two things, and you mentioned this in a conversation we had earlier today, and I think actually just mentioned a minute ago. What we need is a process. And with that process, we need the process to work independent of any tools that we might have, right?
right.
So you can implement a process using pen and paper. You can implement a process using a spreadsheet. You can implement a process using Trello, or you could build something that implements the process perfectly for you, right?
Yeah.
But you have to have that process independent of it. And here's the reason I say that. So let's say that you've decided to adopt a specific LMS, right? It might make, you have decisions to make, right? What's your source of truth for all of your content, right? What's the final best version? What does that look like? And, and so that would lead you to like, right, well, maybe I just want to author in the LMS. Maybe the LMS has
Right.
tools. The LMS is where I'm going to author. For example, Canvas, right? They have some facilities for allowing you to modularize things and take, whether it's a lesson or a module or a unit or an entire course, and put it in Commons and then reuse it other places.
Right.
So they have these ways that you can reuse your modules and then use the course itself for the connective tissue. Maybe that's the way you want to go. Right? You and I have both worked at places where we quote unquote adopted an LMS, but nobody wanted to actually embrace the LMS. And so we ended up fighting our tools every step of
Yeah.
the way. And so, I think we got to look at that. I've also, at my current job, some of the teams used to build things in a certain way. They adopted Canvas, but they didn't want to change the way that they did things. So they just kept their same thing and then built a bunch of glue code to make it work with Canvas.
Right.
Again, is that the right? I mean, I think I think you have to decide, if everything's going to be in Canvas or LMS X, Y, or Z, maybe just embracing that is the way to go. Maybe not. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, I know we've also done things where everybody did things in Word files and used redline edits and then tried to get them into the LMS, which was awful. Same thing with Google Docs, not great. We've used Markdown and Git, not great. So I don't know. What are your thoughts?
So yeah, it's difficult because if you think about your traditional college courses as they're delivered through the LMS, if you make all of your edits and all of your content in the LMS, then that's actually version controlled if you think about it, right? Because each new semester you've got a new version of it that's coming
Yep.
out that you can
Yep.
update, and as long as you pull from and I think that's one of the issues, right? That we've worked with people who've done this master course philosophy, and
Yep.
the master course is solid, but then somebody makes a change to a typo in the live course, and then it doesn't get translated back. That's the one thing that happens all the time, right?
Yep.
Um, I always in trying to design things that would be multimodal. What if, like, right now you had all of your content in an LMS and you for a face-to-face class and everybody had to go remote and the person at home didn't have internet and had to drive to had the opportunity to drive to a library right now or in the college parking lot and download stuff from to be able to access offline.
Right.
At that point, isn't the best practice then to develop somewhere that would spit out PDFs and have all
Yeah,
of your content
possibly. Right.
PDFs?
Yeah.
But I think that the one thing that really, because I don't care if you do it in Word or in any tool, Word Online or Google Docs, anything that allows you to version. But I think one of the problems we run into is people don't use the actual capabilities of the tools themselves.
Right.
Like
Right.
Google Docs lets you version control, name versions, do all kinds of crazy
Yeah,
stuff
it's
in there,
great.
right? And then if you actually put the file name in the footer and keep track of revisions like you should, all that type of stuff, like I think PDFs would work if if when you were to copy paste from Word or Google Docs into the Canvas rich editor, or if there was an import feature, that it wouldn't include all the gross freaking code that Word and Docs spits out when they export HTML.
Right.
That's one of the bigger problems, because then I can't even really style things, because Word's thrown in all this garbage inline styling that just screws anything I want to do up as a design, as somebody, designing the look of the layout.
Right. Well, and that's where it's really tempting, right, to use something like Git or revision control for software, because all of that. So, I always get, I know I know you like the revision thing at the bottom of a page and this kind of stuff, but it's always manual.
Yeah.
And my faith in anything that somebody has to remember to do is zero. My assumption is that whatever's at the bottom of that page is wrong.
Yeah.
Because somebody forgot to update it at one point or another. That's where, software development tools are really great, because all that revision control is automatic. However, it's not a great place to store a lot of things that we do, right? So it's not code. And
I can make a commit without a note, and then you gotta go hunt. Can you compare between versions? Like relying on people is where all these things break down, right?
It all breaks down with the human being. So
the issue though that I have with Git specifically, and I guess I looked at it today with some pull request stuff, is like, we're in the back and forth that like you and I, you as a subject matter expert and me as a learning experience designer would do. Like, there's commenting and things that go back and forth, and those comments that live as close to the source as possible is what we really, I think is what's most effective. So especially where in, like, with Google Docs, which, if you can't tell, is my preferred software for editing text in that comment, I can assign that to you or to somebody else. I can see the comment thread right there when we can go back and forth on stuff. I don't see that, and I didn't see it today with a pull request from Git, and if I made a comment, that I could actually turn that into an issue as something that may or may not need to be addressed. Like, how do I have a comment that I know for sure you, as the person who are working on this, author of this document, are going to be able to see and address, and us to be able to have a dialogue back and forth there? I don't know.
Well, and I think there's another concept here that that doesn't apply to code, right? Code is code. I'm not going to have a conversation with you and necessarily get comments and have this kind of creative back and forth on my code, right? I'm going to get there. I'm going to put it in. I'm going to write the unit test. I'm going to check it in. We might have a code review, but that's a different thing. That's almost a QA thing. But here's, so I work for a company.
Can I, because if I have a comment on your code, it's going to be on the front end implementation of that. Like, why is that button there? That's not actually on the code. That's actually on the visual that I'm seeing. Correct?
Well, possibly, right? But there's a lot of code that doesn't have a user interface, right? And so you go through and have code reviews just of the code itself and that kind of stuff. But yeah, you don't generally just comment on it. But yeah, you're right. As an end user, user acceptance testing, you're going to ask about that button, and then that's going to go back to a defect and eventually get assigned to me, and then I'll have to figure out where the code is to fix that or change it or whatever. So I worked for a company in the early 2000s that was an ISO 9000 company. Mm-hmm. And so ISO 9000, right, is, at a really high level, I'm going to butcher this, I'm sure, for anybody that actually knows what ISO 9000 is. But basically what it says, right, is that you have policies and procedures that you have, and they meet a certain, standard, and that you have processes, very strict and stringent processes and approvals that go in to make changes to any of those over time, and they're tracked and you can see the entire history. That's one part of it. Mm-hmm. That's not all of it, but that's one part of it. So, but a lot of times, just like with curriculum stuff, when you spin up an idea of a lesson, or you spin up, what you're going to do, or you spin up a new, I want to make a change to a process or procedure. What I want to do is I want to just sketch that out between you and me. I want to go back and forth and change a bunch of things. And like maybe 80% of what we just talked about, we throw away and we finally get to where we're at, right? And so that initial churn is useless. It's the process is important for us to get to where we need to go, but nobody needs to keep track of that.
Right.
right? That's
Right.
just
Right.
brainstorming and throwing things against the wall and figuring out what it is. And now finally, okay, now this is what this lesson should look like. And now we can kind of comment back and forth, and now we can tweak it to the end, and now we're done. And so what we did with the ISO 9000 stuff is we had over here, we had all this churn that we'd go back and forth internally. We wouldn't even let the system know that we were thinking about making a change.
Right.
Once we found something that like was reasonably close to what we wanted to, then we put it through the official process for comment, approval, and whatever. I mean, you can imagine the pain in the rear end it would be if all that churn had to go through
Yes.
the official process. And I think there's a similar thing here, right?
Well,
That there's this back and forth that should, go, whether it's an outline or whatever it is, before it even gets into, okay, where's our source of truth? Because we can't even talk about this as truth. It's not even an idea yet. It's just us batting stuff around.
it's very similar, right, within the design process. Within
Yep.
the design process, at the very beginning, you don't put any objections up. It's all just
Right.
what if,
Yep.
right? And yeah, 99% of that is trash that's going to go away. I think and that's why they made the decision kind of this morning with some people I was talking to about not actually caring what we use at the very beginning to get started.
Right.
Because in my mind, the subject matter expert probably makes the most money. Let's let them use the tool that's going to be the easiest for them.
Yep.
But at some point, and I think this is what it boils down to, is we need checkpoints along the way where we're going to have a very specific tool, place, naming convention to where we're going to put things. And at that point, they are locked because somebody else is going to have to start working with them, probably that doesn't have access, or we don't want to teach people the system that we used before. Like if we're going to use Git for writing
Yep.
content and everything else. No copy editor on the planet is, well, shouldn't say that. There's not a lot of copy editors on the planet anyway. There's fewer of them that actually understand how Git works to be able to use Git.
Right. Or they have any interest whatsoever in Markdown. Right. So again, the team I
Yes.
was talking to, they happen to, I mean, A, they ran a lot of technical content, and B, a lot of them, if not all of them, are either current or former developers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, great. I mean, Git and Markdown is just, I mean, yeah, what else would you write it in? But then we were talking about, well, what about a project management course? What about a user experience design course? What about a, digital marketing course? Those people have no interest in Git or Markdown or anything else. That is an impediment to me.
Well, and even HTML, right? Even with
Yeah.
straight HTML, I'd have to have some other thing, annotation thing, something, whatever on top of that to be able to do any type of revision or suggestion or commenting as part of a process.
Yeah. I mean, I think I think you need to assume that you need to have a WYSIWYG editor for. You got to have a WYSIWYG editor somewhere along the way for people to work with this. Because
Yeah.
again, we put the format at the forefront, and we do that because we are developers and we know HTML, we know Markdown or whatever. But that's not the key. The content's the key. The format is just whatever.
But if
it's an artifact of the system.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we're bumping into all over the place is getting it into the LMS.
Right.
So if the LMS just let us author and do things in a way that made sense for the process of curriculum development, I think that's something that would have some value, because now getting it into the LMS, you have two options, right? You're going to copy paste some HTML or some text that's obviously HTML if you look at the source backend code, or you're going to install or attach, embed PDFs.
Right.
What other options are there?
Not much right now.
Yeah.
Right. So,
but
yeah,
I think having those checkpoints, naming conventions, and the type of files that you're going to have at those checkpoints is important, because at least at the checkpoints, that becomes a version and a moment of truth that everything before that we don't even care about. We could always maybe look back if it's scratch pads and notes and all these other weird file names, brainstorm, mind map, blah, 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 that we have that got us to here. But from here, this is almost like we're starting over, right? Same thing when we get to the point of this all goes through then QA and some proofing and whatever, and then we get to another checkpoint that we lock and we are not going back. Everything becomes a new version of this thing based on this being our new starting point.
Yep.
I don't know.
So yeah, so I mean, so I think that, you know, to kind of circle back to the beginning of the conversation, right? This last rant we just went on is why it's important to separate the process from the tools. And again, maybe there's a time and a place, and I think it's desirable to build a system that implements a particular process in a way that really works, but we shouldn't be waiting for the golden hammer.
Yeah.
Right. Because there are lots of tools out there available to us to do this. They all have their advantages and their disadvantages. They all have their efficiencies and their inefficiencies. But at the end of the day, it really is all about how you manage the work. And then you can work on making the implementation and the tools easier after the fact.
And to also bring up the modularity thing we discussed previously, you know, these lessons might be modular within like a 16-week class, modular, and then an 8-week class, modular down to a boot camp experience, but then also modular where I may want to take this chunk from here and use that in another course. And that's where stuff really starts to break, because you'll notice errors over here that don't go back to the source of truth, and just like, it becomes, doing responsive learning experience design right requires a lot of forethought up front as to how we're going to put this system together.
Agreed. And I think, you know, again, it all starts with the process and with these first principles, right? And then tools and systems and golden hammers can fall out of that, but you gotta have a good process to do this, and whether it's manual or automatic or a mix, right? Because otherwise, what system are you going to build?
Well, and think about it too, right? If your process is too specific with all of its tools, then you become beholden to the tool and not, like you said, to the process, right? Within the process of curriculum development, overarching, what do I want? Right. I want some content in an LMS, and how am I going to get there? I don't care how I get there necessarily. That could be fluid based on the different disciplines and different people I'm working with. But at the end of the day, as long as your thing can get me this, and we agree that we're going to use, what we're going to use to get there, I think it can be fluid a little bit.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, you know, as an analogy, right? Did you ever read the book, Getting Things Done?
Is that by the Navy SEAL guy that likes to make his bed?
No, this is by I forget the guy's name, but it's a system, right? It's a system of and it can be implemented anywhere. It can be implemented in a notebook. It could be implemented in a file cabinet. It could be implemented with whatever. It doesn't make any difference. But it's a system and it's a process. And basically the whole thing is how do you know that at any given point during the day, you're working on the most important thing you should be working on right then? Right. That's the premise, right?
Right.
And you can use whatever system. And then I looked at a bunch of different software and, all these different things that implement that system.
Right.
I've done it with like a day timer. I've done it with a notebook or whatever. And then finally, when we worked at Learning House, right? You remember their CEO was all about NOSBI, right? Mm-hmm. Well, all NOSBI was a software realization of this system, right? Okay. But you don't need NOSBI to do getting things done. You don't need anything. You need a piece of paper and a system, right? And a filing system and a way to keep track of things. And however you do that doesn't make any difference because the system is the system. And I think it's the same here, right? The responsive learning experience design needs to be a process and a system that is separate of any technology or artifacts that go with it. And then you can start thinking about, well, how would I implement this? How would I automate this? What tools can I use to do this? But it has to be standalone, right?
Well, and if we're going to clearly define and mandate the tool that you have to use, we might as well just call it the rigid learning experience design system, right? Because responsive also in how it's developed, not just how it's delivered. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So cool. Well, I think we talked that to death for today. I'm sure we have other days that we can talk that to death some more, but good place to stop for the week. It's been quite a week, right? Lockdown and whole new world, but we made it.
Yes. Sun is out. People are out walking.
Spring is almost here. It feels like.
I think they're making some firm decisions about whether or not we're going to come back to school this year, which I don't think anybody's going to do. Yeah, summer classes, looks like most summer classes are going to be online, which most summer classes are 8-week online anyway.
Right.
So I'm hoping that all of us in any type of education and training really start to focus on the best of online, the best of face-to-face.
Right.
How can we make sure that people anywhere and everywhere who want to learn something are able to do that?
Agreed.
And I think we're cool.
I love it.
Cool.
Me too. Cool.
All right, man.
See you next week.
Yep. Take care, Ward.